The year is 1942. A dark shadow looms over Europe. Nazi Germany has conquered most of the continent. Millions of people are being sent to concentration camps, and the world doesn't yet fully know what's happening inside those camps. It's in this dark period that a British soldier will accomplish the impossible. He will wear the enemy's uniform, infiltrate the most terrifying death camp in history, and pull hundreds of innocent people from the clutches of death. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to my channel and hit the like button. This man is Charlescoward, and his story is one of the bravest, most daring, and least known tales of heroism from World War II. If this is your first time watching this channel, we uncover forgotten heroes of World War II, secret operations, and stories buried in the dusty pages of history. If you enjoy this kind of content, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because this story will keep you glued to your seat. Now let's take a look at who Charlescoward was. Charles Joseph Coward was born in 1905 in the Edmonton district of London. He came from a typical English working-class family. His father was an ordinary laborer, his mother a housewife. Coward grew up on the streets. He had a difficult childhood, but those tough years shaped him into a tough, resilient, and extremely cunning man. Life taught him an early lesson. If you want to survive, you have to be both brave and smart. Coward joined the British Army as a young man. Military service gave him discipline and order, but it couldn't completely extinguish the rebellious spirit that was in his nature. Coward wasn't someone who blindly followed rules. He was a man who challenged rules and turned the system to his advantage when necessary. And this trait would later save his life and, more importantly, enable him to save hundreds of other lives. When World War II began in 1939, Coward was 34 years old. He was an experienced soldier serving in the Royal Artillery. In the early years of the war, he was sent to France. He fought against the Germans as part of the British Expeditionary Force. But in the spring of 1940, everything went wrong. The Germans invaded France with blitzkrieg tactics. The French army collapsed. British forces were forced to retreat, and during this chaotic withdrawal, Charlescoward was captured. German soldiers seized him and sent him off to a prisoner of war camp. It was at this point that Coward's true character began to emerge. For most prisoners of war, captivity meant the end of the war, staying in the camp, waiting for the war to end, trying to survive. But Coward didn't think that way. For him, captivity was simply a new battlefield, a place where he could continue fighting the enemy from within the enemy's heart. From the very first day of his capture, Coward began making escape plans. And he didn't just make plans, he put them into action. According to records, Coward made a total of 7 escape attempts throughout the war, 7 times. He was caught every time, punished every time, but he never gave up. His first escape attempt happened just a few weeks after being captured. Coward and a few friends seized an opportunity during a transfer and escaped. They walked through German territory for days. They struggled with hunger, thirst, and exhaustion, but eventually they were caught. As punishment, Coward was put in solitary confinement. He stayed alone for days in a dark cell, but this didn't break him. In his second escape attempt, Coward stole a German officer's uniform. Yes, you heard that right. He managed to steal a German officer's uniform inside a prisoner of war camp. He walked right out through the camp gates wearing this uniform. The guards even saluted him. But a few kilometers later, he was questioned at a checkpoint and captured. His punishment was harsher this time, but Coward still didn't give up. Third, fourth, fifth attempts. He tried a different method each time. He was caught each time, but each time he learned something new, how the German system worked, where its weak points were, how he could move without being noticed. Coward was becoming an escape expert. After a while, the Germans began monitoring Coward specifically. This man was dangerous. He wasn't just trying to escape himself, he was encouraging other prisoners too. He was boosting morale. He was keeping the spirit of resistance alive. And that was the last thing the Germans wanted. They transferred Coward to different camps. Each time he was sent to the most heavily guarded camps. But Coward figured out every camp's system. He made new friends at every camp, and he made new escape plans at every camp. If you're enjoying this story, subscribe and like. Now, let's pause here and think about something. Why was Charles Coward so persistent? Why did he keep trying to escape despite being caught and punished repeatedly? Most people would have given up after a few failed attempts. Most people would have preferred to wait out the war in the relative safety of the camp, but Coward didn't. I think the answer lies in his character. Coward was a man who refused to submit. He wouldn't accept living in captivity. And perhaps more importantly, he believed that his duty to fight the enemy didn't end with being captured. As a British soldier, wherever he was, he had to continue causing harm to the enemy. And cause harm he did. But he found a method far more effective than escape attempts. In 1943, an event occurred that would completely change Coward's life. This event transformed him from an ordinary escape expert into one of history's bravest rescuers. That year, Coward was transferred to a prisoner of war camp called Stalag 8B. This camp was in eastern Germany, near what is now the Polish border. And near this camp was one of the most horrific places in history, Auschwitz. Yes, Auschwitz, the death camp where millions of people were murdered, the symbol of the Holocaust, the darkest chapter in human history. The prisoners of war at Stalag 8B were forced to work. They were made to serve Germany's war economy, and some of these prisoners were put to work at the IG Farben factory, which was part of the Auschwitz complex. IG Farben, the German chemical giant, was producing synthetic rubber and fuel, and for this production they used both prisoners of war and concentration camp inmates as slave labor. Charles Coward was appointed as the representative of British prisoners of war working at this factory. This position gave him extraordinary freedom of movement. He could meet with German officials on behalf of other prisoners, he could go to different sections of the factory, and most importantly, he could move around near Auschwitz. Coward used this freedom to the fullest, and what he saw changed him forever. While working at the factory, Coward began making contact with concentration camp prisoners. These prisoners were mostly Jews. They worked barefoot, in torn clothes, with bodies so thin you could count their bones. There was fear and hopelessness in their eyes. And when Coward started talking to them, he learned the horrific truth. The prisoners told him everything. They told him about the gas chambers. They told him about the crematoriums. They told him about the thousands of people the trains brought every day. Women, children, the elderly. Those sent directly to their deaths. At first, Coward couldn't believe what he was hearing. How could something so horrific be happening? But the evidence was everywhere. The smell of ash in the sky, the smoke rising from the chimneys, the people who kept disappearing. Coward decided to get this information out. The world needed to know about this atrocity. The Allies needed to learn the truth. Maybe they could do something. Maybe they could destroy the camps with bombing raids. Maybe they could disable the railways. Maybe they could at least mobilize world public opinion. Coward began secretly writing reports. He noted down what he saw, what he heard, what he learned on small pieces of paper. And he sent these notes to England through Red Cross packages. This was an incredibly dangerous undertaking. If he was caught, certain death awaited him. The Germans didn't forgive this kind of espionage activity, but Coward took the risk. And the reports reached England. Coward's observation reports became one of the first reliable sources revealing the true face of Auschwitz. Allied intelligence evaluated this information, and the world slowly began to comprehend the scale of the Holocaust. But Coward didn't just write reports. He refused to be a passive observer. If people were being killed, he had to save people. and save them he did. How? This is where the most incredible part of the story begins. Get ready. Coward developed a plan to infiltrate Auschwitz. He obtained a German uniform, and wearing this uniform, he entered the concentration camp. A British prisoner of war disguised as a German soldier walked through the gates of Auschwitz. Read that sentence again, because this actually happened. Inside the camp, Coward made contact with Jewish prisoners. He presented them with a plan. They could be transferred to the prisoner of war camp using the identities of deceased inmates. How? Coward was collecting the identification information of dead prisoners of war, and he gave this information to Jewish prisoners who were still alive. So, on paper, a dead prisoner of war appeared to still be alive. And instead of a dead Jewish prisoner, the person who took that identity was transferred to the prisoner of war camp. This system wasn't perfect, it was dangerous, it could be discovered at any moment, but it worked. Coward and his helpers saved more than 400 Jews from the gas chambers of Auschwitz using this method. More than 400. Each one a life, each one a family, each one people who today might have grandchildren, great-grandchildren. Charles Coward was a prisoner of war. He had no weapons, he had no army, he had no tanks, no planes, no bombs. But he showed what difference one man could make on his own. He proved the power of courage, intelligence, and humanity. And his story isn't over yet. In Part 2, we'll dive into the details of Coward's Auschwitz operations. We'll see who he saved, how he saved them, and what he went through in this process. And we'll learn how his testimony played a critical role at the Nuremberg Trials after the war ended. If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe, because likes help this content reach more people, and the stories of heroes like Charles Coward deserve to be known by everyone. Now, let's take a short break, but we'll be right back. Stay with us. Welcome back to Part 2, dear viewers. Let's continue. Now let's dive deep into Charles Coward's Auschwitz operations, because what this man did goes far beyond a simple story of heroism. This was a systematic rescue operation, a one-man war waged by a prisoner of war against history's most horrific death machine, deep in enemy territory. First, we need to fully understand the situation Coward found himself in. Stalag 8B was one of Germany's largest prisoner of war camps. Tens of thousands of Allied soldiers were held here. British, Americans, Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, and soldiers from many other nations. The camp was near the town of Lambsdorff, and about 40 kilometers from there stood the Auschwitz complex. Auschwitz was actually not a single camp. It was a massive complex consisting of 3 main camps and dozens of sub-camps. Auschwitz I was the main camp. Auschwitz II, Birkenau, was the death camp, where the gas chambers and crematoriums were located. And Auschwitz III, Monowitz, was the labor camp, where the IG Farben factory was located. This third camp was where Coward and other prisoners of war were forced to work. IG Farben was the largest chemical company of its time. They produced synthetic rubber and fuel. These were critical materials for the war machine, and they needed a massive workforce for this production. They sourced this labor from 2 places: prisoners of war and concentration camp inmates. The prisoners of war were relatively lucky. The Geneva Convention protected them, at least in theory. The Germans couldn't treat Allied prisoners of war the way they treated concentration camp inmates, because their own soldiers were also prisoners in Allied hands. There was a mutual balance. That's why prisoners of war weren't starved or systematically killed. They lived in poor conditions. They were forced to work, but at least they could survive. The situation for concentration camp inmates was completely different. They weren't treated as human beings. They were worked as long as they could work and killed when they could no longer work. And every day new prisoners arrived by train. Women, children, the elderly, most were sent directly to the gas chambers. Those who could work were used as slave labor, a truly terrible situation. Charlescoward stood at the intersection of these two worlds. On one side, the relatively safe status of a prisoner of war, on the other, hell itself, and he decided to use this position to build a bridge between the two worlds. Coward's appointment as prisoner representative was a turning point for him. This position gave him extraordinary authority. He could meet with German officials on behalf of other prisoners, he could relay complaints, he could make contact with Red Cross representatives, and most importantly, he could move freely around the factory complex. Coward used this freedom to its fullest. First, he began gathering intelligence. He learned every corner of the factory. He figured out the security system. He noted which guard was where and when, which door was left open at what time, which areas were less supervised. This information would be vital for his future operations. Then he began making contact with concentration camp inmates. This was extremely dangerous. Communication between prisoners of war and concentration camp inmates was strictly forbidden. Anyone caught would face severe punishment. But Coward found a way nonetheless. While working at the factory, he made eye contact with Jewish prisoners. He gave small signals. He showed them he could be trusted. And over time, he managed to secretly talk with several inmates. He learned from them what was happening in the camp, and what he learned shook him to his core. The prisoners told him everything. Trains came every night. People were brought from all over Europe. A selection was made at the train station. SS officers divided the new arrivals into two groups. Those who went right were sent to the labor camp. Those who went left walked directly to the gas chambers. Children, the elderly, the sick, pregnant women, they all went left, and they were never seen again. The gas chambers looked like shower rooms. People were told they would be taking showers. They were asked to undress. Then they were sent inside. The doors were locked, and Zyklon B gas was released through holes in the ceiling. Within 15 minutes, everyone inside was dead. Then the bodies were carried to the crematoriums and burned. Such immense brutality, unfortunately. Coward was shocked when he heard this information. He had trouble believing it. How could such systematic, such industrial mass murder be possible? But the evidence was everywhere. The smoke rising from the crematorium chimneys, the smell of burning in the air, the fear in the eyes of the prisoners, everything screamed the truth. And Coward took action. First, he began documenting what he saw and heard. He took notes on small pieces of paper. He hid these notes secretly, and he began sending them to England through Red Cross packages. Red Cross packages were aid packages regularly sent to prisoners of war. They contained food, cigarettes, medicine, and other basic necessities. The Germans inspected these packages, but it was impossible to examine every single one. Coward exploited this gap. He placed secret messages inside the packages. He sent coded information. These messages reached the War Office in England. Coward's reports became one of the first reliable intelligence sources about Auschwitz. The reports described the gas chambers, the crematoriums, and the systematic massacre in detail. Allied intelligence evaluated this information, and the scale of the Holocaust slowly began to become clear. But Coward didn't just write reports, he wanted to save people. This is where his most daring and dangerous plan came into play. Coward had realized something. Sometimes prisoners died in the prisoner of war camp, from illness, accidents, sometimes from German brutality. And every dead prisoner had an identity, a name, a number, a record. These records were an essential part of German bureaucracy. Similarly, inmates died in the concentration camp too. In fact, dying was normal there. Surviving was the exception. And dead inmates were also recorded, at least officially. Coward thought about combining these two systems. What if a dead prisoner of war's identity was given to a living Jewish inmate? What if, in place of a dead inmate, someone could transfer to the prisoner of war camp with this new identity? The plan was simple but extremely difficult to execute, and the risks were incredibly high. First, Coward had to find people he could trust, in both the prisoner of war camp and the concentration camp. These people would be risking their lives. One mistake would mean death for everyone. Second, forged documents had to be prepared. German bureaucracy was extremely meticulous. Everything was recorded. If an inconsistency or discrepancy was noticed, the entire plan could collapse. Third, the problem of physical resemblance had to be solved. Did the people whose identities were being swapped need to at least roughly resemble each other, or would the Germans notice? Coward found solutions to all these problems. For trustworthy people, he started with his own friends, men who had participated in escape attempts with him, who had proven their loyalty. When these men heard Coward's plan, they agreed without hesitation. They had seen the same things. They also wanted to do something. On the concentration camp side, Coward made contact with people in leadership positions among the Jewish inmates. These were prisoner overseers, called capos. Some capos were ruthless, but some were trying to protect their own people. Coward found the right ones. For forged documents, Coward's skills came into play. He was a man who had made 7 escape attempts. He had used forged documents during these escapes. He had learned German bureaucracy, their stamps, their signature styles. Now, this knowledge would save lives. The conditions solved the physical resemblance problem. The concentration camp inmates were so thin, so exhausted, so worn down that it was hard to tell them apart. Their faces were sunken, their hair was shaved, their bodies had become piles of bones. This tragic situation paradoxically provided an advantage for the plan, and the operations began. The first rescue was the hardest for Coward. He was doing everything for the first time. There was a risk of being caught at every step. His heart was pounding as if it would burst from his chest, but he succeeded. A Jewish inmate was transferred to the prisoner of war camp with the identity of a dead British prisoner of war. The man survived. This success gave Coward courage. He refined the system. He collected more identities. He made contact with more inmates, and rescue operations became regular. Sometimes things didn't go as planned. Sometimes plans had to be changed at the last moment. Sometimes breaths were held, hearts stopped, but Coward and his team found a solution every time. Once, during a transfer, a German officer became suspicious. He looked at the face of the new prisoner of war. He started asking questions. Coward immediately intervened. He distracted the officer. He created a fake argument, and while attention was diverted, the inmate was safely admitted to the camp. Another time, an inmate panicked at the last moment. He was supposed to speak German, but his tongue froze. Coward stepped in again. He said the man was sick, that he had a fever. He claimed he was too exhausted to speak, and the Germans bought it. Coward didn't just do identity swaps. He used other methods too. For example, sometimes he hid Jewish inmates inside Red Cross packages. These packages came in large crates. Coward emptied some crates and hid small inmates inside. The crates were transported to the prisoner of war camp, and the inmates reached freedom. Sometimes he also hid inmates among factory waste. Garbage trucks regularly left the factory. These trucks weren't closely inspected. Coward hid some inmates inside these trucks and got them to the camp. Every method was risky. Every operation was a matter of life and death. But Coward didn't stop. He didn't have the luxury of stopping. Every passing day, hundreds, thousands of people were dying in the gas chambers. Every life he could save was a victory. If you're enjoying this story, subscribe and like. So how many people did he save? It's hard to know the exact number. Wartime records were complicated. Some records were lost, some were destroyed. But according to estimates, Coward and his team got more than 400 Jews out of Auschwitz. More than 400 people escaped the gas chambers thanks to him. This number might seem small compared to the 1 million killed at Auschwitz, but every number is a person. Every person is a world. There's a saying in Jewish tradition, whoever saves one life saves the entire world. Coward saved more than 400 worlds. And while doing all this, he risked his own life every moment. Coward came face to face with death many times. Once, during a secret meeting, an SS patrol approached. Coward and his friends hid in a cellar at the last moment. Boots walked overhead, voices were heard, searches were conducted, but they weren't found. Another time, the forged documents on Coward were almost discovered. A German officer wanted to search him. Coward swallowed the documents in his pockets. Yes, swallowed them. He chewed and swallowed the papers to destroy them. When the search was conducted, nothing was found on him. And once, one of his closest collaborators was caught. The man was tortured, but he said nothing. He didn't give up Coward's name. He didn't reveal the secrets, and he was eventually killed. This loss deeply shook Coward, but it didn't stop him. On the contrary, it made him more determined. Coward's courage wasn't just physical. He also carried an incredible psychological burden. He saw death every day. Every day he watched the smoke from chimneys that burned human beings. Every night he heard the screams of people going to the gas chambers, and every morning when he woke up, he had to go back to that hell. Most people would collapse under this pressure. Most people would give in to despair and give up. But Coward was resilient. The difficult childhood he spent on the streets of London had prepared him for these moments. 7 failed escape attempts had made him indomitable, and most importantly, every life he saved gave him new strength. As the war progressed, Coward's operations also evolved. They became more organized, more people got involved, and more lives were saved. But in early 1945, everything changed. Soviet armies were advancing from the east, the Germans were retreating, and the concentration camps began to be evacuated. Auschwitz was evacuated in January 1945. The inmates were sent on death marches. In freezing cold, through the snow, they were marched hundreds of kilometers. Those who couldn't walk were shot where they stood. Thousands of people died on these marches. Coward and other prisoners of war were also moved westward by the Germans. They didn't want to surrender them to the Soviets. A chaotic period lasting months began. Marches, transfers, bombed cities, a collapsing empire. And finally, in May 1945, the war ended. Nazi Germany surrendered. Coward and the other prisoners of war were freed. But Charles Coward's story doesn't end here. After the war, his testimony would play a critical role in one of history's most important trials. At the Nuremberg Trials, while Nazi war criminals were being judged, Coward would take the witness stand, and he would tell the whole world what he saw and experienced. In the third and final part, we'll cover Coward's post-war life, his Nuremberg testimony, and his legacy. And we'll see how this extraordinary man's story was almost forgotten, but should never be forgotten. Now, a short break, but we'll be right back. If this story moved you, subscribe and like. Now, we're moving on to the final part. May 1945. The guns fell silent in Europe. Nazi Germany became history, and Charles Coward, after 6 years of captivity, was finally free. He was going home, to London, to his family, to his normal life. But was normal life even possible for Coward anymore? How could a man who had seen Auschwitz forget what he saw? How could a man who had breathed in the smoke from the gas chambers erase that smell from his memory? How could a man who had pulled hundreds of people from the clutches of death live as if nothing had happened? He couldn't, of course. When Coward returned to England, he wasn't welcomed as a hero, because no one knew what he had done. Yes, he had returned as a prisoner of war, but the details of his story weren't on the public's agenda at that time. The world was busy healing the wounds of war. Millions of people had died. Cities had been reduced to rubble. Everyone had their own pain, their own loss. Coward also tried to quietly continue with his life. He returned to his old job, he tried to see his family, he tried to live as an ordinary British citizen. But the fire inside him wouldn't die out. What he had seen wouldn't leave him alone, and soon the world would need his testimony. In late 1945, the Allied powers made a historic decision. Nazi war criminals would be tried. An international court would be established in the city of Nuremberg, and the greatest crimes in human history would be held accountable before the law. The Nuremberg Trials were a turning point in legal history. Never before had war criminals been tried on this scale and in this manner. The court wasn't just trying the Nazis, it was also sending a message to future generations. War crimes would not go unpunished. Crimes against humanity would be held accountable. In the main Nuremberg trial, the highest-ranking leaders of the Nazi regime were tried: Hermann Göring, Rudolf Hess, Albert Speer, and others. But alongside this, there were also special cases. The IG Farben case was one of them. IG Farben was the company that operated the factory at Auschwitz, the company that used concentration camp inmates as slave labor, and the company that produced Zyklon B gas. Yes, the gas that killed millions of people. IG Farben executives were charged with crimes against humanity, and for this case, witnesses were needed. Charlescoward was one of those witnesses. In 1947, Coward was summoned to Nuremberg. He took the witness stand, and there, before the eyes of the entire world, he described what he had seen at Auschwitz. Coward's testimony made a profound impact at the trial. He wasn't just telling what he had heard, he was telling what he had personally seen. He was an eyewitness. Moreover, an impartial eyewitness. He wasn't Jewish, he wasn't a concentration camp inmate, he was a British prisoner of war, and this added extra credibility to his testimony. Coward described the gas chambers to the court. He described the crematoriums. He described the smoke that rose into the sky every day. He described the working conditions of the inmates, the hunger, the disease, the death. And he described IG Farben's role in this system, how the company used concentration camp inmates as slaves, how those who could no longer work were sent to the gas chambers, and how new inmates were brought in to replace them. During his testimony, Coward experienced emotional moments. At times his voice trembled, his eyes welled up, but he told it. He told everything, because he had to tell it. For those who died, for those who survived, for future generations. Coward's testimony played an important role in the conviction of IG Farben executives. 13 of the company's top executives were found guilty. They were sentenced to prison terms. This was a historic decision showing that corporations could be held responsible for war crimes. But Coward's contribution at Nuremberg wasn't limited to just his testimony. He also began tracking down the people he had saved. Where were the Jews he had smuggled out through identity swaps during the war? Were they alive? Had they been able to start their new lives? He found some of them, and these reunions were the scene of extremely emotional moments. People who owed their lives to him were coming face to face with their Savior. Tears were shed. Thanks were given. Stories were shared. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe. One of these survivors had said to Coward, "You were a stranger to me. You didn't know me at all, but you risked your life to save me. Why? Why did you do it?" Coward's answer was simple: because it was the right thing to do. This simple answer actually summarized Coward's entire philosophy. He wasn't fighting for grand ideologies or abstract concepts. He was simply doing what was right. People were being killed before his eyes, and he was trying to stop it as much as he could. Not to be a hero, but to be human. After the Nuremberg Trials, Coward's story slowly began to come to light. The British press did interviews with him. His story appeared in newspapers, and in 1954, the British government officially recognized his heroism. Coward was awarded the George Medal. This medal was the highest award for bravery that Britain could give to civilians. It was given for courage shown not on the battlefield, but in extraordinary circumstances. And Coward more than deserved this award. At the medal ceremony, Coward was humble, as always. He didn't proclaim himself a hero. He didn't make grand statements. He simply said, "I only did my duty." The real heroes are the people who manage to survive that hell. This humility was an inseparable part of Coward's character. He was a man who avoided the spotlight. He wasn't seeking fame and glory. He had done what he did because it needed to be done, and now he wanted to return to normal. But history didn't completely let him go. In 1961, the world witnessed a new Nazi trial. Adolf Eichmann, one of the architects of the Holocaust, had been captured by Israel and was being tried in Jerusalem. This case brought the Holocaust back to the world's agenda, and Coward's story came to the forefront again. During the Eichmann trial, many Holocaust survivors testified, and some of these survivors told how they had survived thanks to Charles Coward, how a British prisoner of war had infiltrated Auschwitz and saved them. These testimonies resonated greatly in Israel. In 1963, the State of Israel awarded Charles Coward the title of Righteous Among the Nations. This title was given to people who risked their own lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. A tree was planted in Coward's name at the Yad Vashem Holocaust Memorial Center, in the Garden of the Righteous Among the Nations, alongside other rescuers. Coward accepted this honor with great pride. It was the most meaningful award he had received in his life, because it was a thank you from the people he had saved, an expression of gratitude from their children and grandchildren. But Coward's story wasn't just about heroism. His life also showed the deep effects of war on the human spirit. After the war, Coward never fully recovered. What he had seen at Auschwitz followed him for the rest of his life. He had nightmares. He spent sleepless nights. Today, we call this post-traumatic stress disorder. Back then, there was no such definition. It was just called war fatigue, and Coward carried this fatigue for the rest of his life. Don't forget to like and subscribe for this hero. Sometimes he would wake up at night and see smoke rising from chimneys in the darkness. Sometimes, while walking down the street, he would suddenly feel himself among the barbed wire of Auschwitz. Sometimes a smell, a sound, an image would suddenly take him back to those days, and these moments didn't diminish as the years passed. Coward turned to alcohol to cope with this trauma. Alcohol provided a temporary escape, but in the long run, it made things worse. His health deteriorated, his relationships suffered, and the hero quietly continued fighting his own war. In 1976, Charles Coward closed his eyes at the age of 71. He died in London, the city where he was born. Not many people attended his funeral. No grand ceremonies were held. He didn't make the headlines. He left this world quietly, humbly, but his legacy lives on. Today, the grandchildren of the people cowards saved live all around the world, in Israel, America, England, Australia, doctors, teachers, engineers, artists, mothers, fathers. They all exist because a British soldier chose to risk his own life 80 years ago. The tree at Yad Vashem still stands. Every year, thousands of visitors walk through that garden, and they see Charles Coward's name. Perhaps most don't know who he was. Perhaps they just see it as a name, but that name represents the savior of more than 400 lives. Now, at the end of this long journey, I want to ask you a question. Why did Charles Coward do this? He wasn't a superhero. He had no special powers. He wasn't rich. He wasn't powerful. He wasn't influential. He was an ordinary man, an ordinary British soldier from the working-class neighborhoods of London. But he made an extraordinary choice. He spoke where everyone else was silent. He looked where everyone else turned away, and he stayed where everyone else fled. Perhaps this is exactly what heroism is. Not great powers or abilities, just making the right choice at the right moment, looking fear, danger, and death in the face, and still doing what's right. Charles Coward showed us that this is possible. He proved that one person can make a difference even in the darkest times. And this is perhaps his greatest legacy. Today, the world still experiences dark times. Wars, oppression, injustices continue. And perhaps there's a little Charles Coward inside all of us, someone who wants to do the right thing but can't gather the courage. Coward's story can be a source of inspiration for us to find that courage. We don't have to do great things. It's enough to just make the right choice in the opportunities that come our way. Sometimes this can be as simple as extending a helping hand to a stranger. Sometimes speaking out against injustice. Sometimes doing what's hard. Charles Coward chose to do what was hard, and that choice saved hundreds of lives. Now, as I finish this video, I have a request for you. Share this story. Spread Charles Coward's name, because heroes like him should not be forgotten. Their stories should be passed on to future generations. And maybe, just maybe, these stories will inspire someone, move someone to action, change someone's life. If this video moved you, don't forget to hit the subscribe button, like the video, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps me reach more people with these stories. And I promise, more is coming. Forgotten heroes of World War II, secret operations, stories buried in the dark pages of history. All on this channel. In the next video, I'll tell another incredible story from World War II, a story as brave as Charles Coward's, perhaps even more surprising. The story of a woman who saved thousands of children from death in a country under Nazi occupation. Who is this woman? How did she do it? And why have you never heard her name? The answers are in the next video. Until then, I'll continue searching for heroes lost in the dusty pages of history, and you continue this journey with me. See you soon. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye.